She agreed to a contract marriage, then the Korean billionaire husband became obsessed. The penthouse overlooking the Han River was a fortress of glass and steel. Minimalist furniture. Ambient lighting that never shifted. Air conditioning calibrated to exactly 21 degrees Celsius. Hyun-suk Kang stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his charcoal suit immaculate, his posture revealing nothing. Below, Seoul pulsed with life, millions of variables he would never control. But here, in this space, every element obeyed his design. His assistant's voice cut through the silence. "Sir, the International Ethics Committee has made their decision." Hyun-suk didn't turn. He already knew what was coming. They're recommending a freeze on the expansion deal. The concern is, optics. They want evidence of stability. A family image. The words hung in the air like an equation with missing variables. Hyun-suk's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had spent 15 years building Kang Global Holdings into an empire that moved billions across 3 continents. He had optimized supply chains, restructured entire divisions, and turned risk into revenue. But this was a problem numbers couldn't solve. "Prepare a proposal," he said finally, his voice measured, devoid of emotion. "A contract arrangement. Legal. Time-bound. Professional." "Yes, sir. I'll compile a list of qualified candidates." Hyun-suk nodded once. This wasn't romance. This was strategy. Across the city, in a sleek co-working space in Gangnam, Amina Bello was finishing a risk assessment report. At 29, she had built a reputation for precision, analyzing corporate structures, identifying imbalance before it became crisis. Her laptop screen glowed with spreadsheets and projection models, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, anticipating questions her clients wouldn't think to ask. The ping of an unfamiliar email drew her attention. Subject, proposal, legally binding contract marriage. Confidential. Amina's brow furrowed. Spam. A joke. She hovered over the delete button, but curiosity, her professional instinct, made her pause. She opened it. The language was clinical. Precise. Almost surgical in its clarity. Duration, 18 months. Compensation, substantial. Emotional involvement, explicitly excluded. Public appearances, scheduled. Privacy, guaranteed. Amina read it twice. Her first reaction was disbelief. What kind of man proposes marriage like a merger agreement? Who reduces a life partnership to terms and conditions? She had spent years refusing to compromise her independence for anyone. She valued autonomy, mutual respect, partnership built on choice, not transaction. Every instinct told her to delete the email and forget it existed. But practicality whispered differently. The sender's credentials were impeccable. Kang Global Holdings, a name that appeared in every major financial report she analyzed. The structure of the proposal itself revealed meticulous attention to detail, the kind only someone accustomed to absolute control could produce. And there was something else. The proposal didn't manipulate. It didn't charm. It didn't pretend to offer what it couldn't deliver. It was honest. That unsettled her more than flattery would have. Amina leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming against the desk. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't naive. But she was curious, professionally, intellectually curious about the man who would approach marriage as a business solution. She could ask questions. Set boundaries. Walk away at any moment. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, typing a measured response. No commitment. Only inquiry. The reply came within minutes. Sharp. Efficient. Unflinching. No false promises. No attempts to persuade. Just terms, clearly stated. Amina read each sentence carefully, weighing every clause against her values. She wasn't agreeing, not yet. She was testing. calculating, ensuring her autonomy remained intact. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening in his penthouse. The space was exactly as she expected, controlled, curated, devoid of personal warmth. Soft lighting. Neutral tones. A single glass table positioned precisely between two minimalist chairs. Hyun-suk Kang arrived exactly on time. He didn't smile. Didn't offer pleasantries. He sat across from her and outlined the arrangement in clear, clipped sentences. "This is not a romance," he said evenly. "It is an agreement. You maintain public appearances. Your private life remains yours. I do not interfere." Amina studied him, the sharp lines of his face, the carefully controlled posture, the complete absence of pretense. "And if I choose to walk away?" she asked, her voice calm but testing. His gaze didn't waver. "Then I will find another solution. No pressure. No manipulation. Just truth." For the first time in years, Amina felt she was negotiating with someone who respected boundaries as much as she did. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would." They spoke for an hour. Terms clarified. Boundaries established. Expectations aligned. There was no awkwardness in the silence between them, only two people measuring futures, acknowledging the unspoken, recognizing the strange symmetry of their arrangement. This was a transaction. Nothing more. And in that moment, Amina knew she hadn't surrendered her values. She was entering with her eyes wide open, her autonomy intact. The contract was signed that night. But neither of them knew how quickly control could become obsession. The first morning in the penthouse felt like inhabiting a museum. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting geometric patterns across marble floors. Everything was perfect, immaculate, sterile, untouched by genuine life. Amina moved through the space with careful observation, cataloging the architecture of Hyun-suk's carefully constructed world. Separate bedrooms. Scheduled meals. A shared calendar for public appearances. She had agreed to an arrangement. She had not agreed to disappear. The contract marriage began like a business merger. Separate bedrooms on opposite ends of the penthouse. Scheduled meals logged into a shared digital calendar. Public appearances planned 3 weeks in advance, complete with wardrobe coordination and pre-approved talking points. Their living space felt less like a home and more like a high-end corporate residence, functional, efficient, emotionally neutral. Hyun-suk operated within the arrangement exactly as he had promised, with precision. He monitored logistics. Ensured Amina had everything she required. Never crossed physical boundaries. To him, she was a component in a system he had designed, necessary, valued for her function, but ultimately part of the structure. Amina noticed the pattern immediately. He observed her the way an architect might study a building, analytically, from multiple angles, cataloging details for future reference. Not staring. Observing. There was a difference, and she recognized it instantly. At first, his attention felt entirely professional. He tracked her schedule to avoid conflicts. Confirmed her preferences for coffee, temperature, lighting. Made adjustments to optimize their coexistence. It was considerate in the most calculated way possible. But Amina was not a variable to be optimized. Their first test came at a private gala hosted by one of Kong Global's major investors. The ballroom glittered with wealth and influence, crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, executives in tailored suits exchanging carefully rehearsed pleasantries. Hyun-suk had briefed her beforehand: stay close, smile appropriately, deflect personal questions, reinforce the stability narrative. Amina nodded. She understood the assignment. But understanding didn't mean compliance. When a senior investor from Singapore made a dismissive comment about African market volatility, Amina didn't defer to Hyun-suk. She didn't glance his way for permission. She simply corrected the assumption, politely, fluently, with data the investor couldn't dispute. The conversation shifted. Other executives leaned in, suddenly interested. Hyun-suk stood beside her, silent, watching the room recalibrate its perception. Something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. He told himself it was reputation management. She represented him. Reflected him. Of course he would pay attention to how she performed. But it wasn't performance he noticed. It was presence. The way she commanded respect without demanding it. The way she listened fully before responding. The way she moved through power dynamics without being consumed by them. She wasn't playing a role. She was simply being herself, and the room responded. On the drive back to the penthouse, Hyun-suk broke the silence. You handled the investor well. I corrected inaccurate information, Amina replied evenly. That's not handling. That's basic competence. He glanced at her, recalibrating. You weren't in the briefing notes. No, she agreed. I wasn't. The implication hung between them, she would not be scripted. Hyun-suk's jaw tightened slightly, not anger, but something closer to reconsideration. He had designed this arrangement to be predictable. Controllable. Yet here was a variable that refused to be contained. The agreement specifies public coordination, he said carefully. It specifies appearances, Amina countered. Not silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hyun-suk nodded once. Understood. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. Back at the penthouse, they moved through their separate routines with practiced efficiency. Amina retreated to her room. Hyun-suk reviewed quarterly projections in his study. The space between them remained vast, cordial, meticulously maintained. But something had shifted. Hyun-suk found himself reviewing the evening's interactions longer than necessary. Replaying her corrections, her composure, the quiet authority in her voice. He dismissed the thoughts as operational analysis, understanding his partner's strengths to leverage them strategically. He didn't recognize it yet as the beginning of something else. In her room, Amina stood by the window, looking out at Seoul's glittering skyline. The city stretched endlessly, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to predict. She had entered this arrangement with clear boundaries. No illusions. No expectations beyond what was written. But she hadn't anticipated the strange gravity of living beside someone who operated entirely through control, someone who seemed almost afraid of anything he couldn't measure. The contract marriage had officially begun. And neither of them realized how quickly distance could become proximity. The penthouse had been designed by an award-winning architect who specialized in what she called contemplative minimalism. Translation: every surface was cold, every corner calculated, every choice made to eliminate the unpredictable chaos of human life. Amina moved through the space on her first full day, taking inventory. The living room featured a single sculptural sofa in charcoal gray, positioned at the optimal angle for viewing the Han River. The kitchen gleamed with appliances that looked more decorative than functional. Her bedroom, spacious, impeccably furnished, had floor-to-ceiling windows and a bed that felt like sleeping in a luxury hotel. Beautiful. Sterile. Emotionally vacant. She unpacked methodically, hanging clothes in the walk-in closet, arranging her laptop and notebooks on the minimal desk. Everything had its place. Nothing was out of order. Just like him. Hyun-suk kept to his own wing of the penthouse. She heard him occasionally, the low murmur of conference calls, the soft click of his study door closing, the precise rhythm of his footsteps on marble floors. But they didn't intersect. Not unless scheduled. Breakfast, 7 a.m. Dinner, 7:30 p.m. Public appearances, as calendared. Everything else remained carefully separate. Their first shared meal was surreal in its formality. Hyun-suk sat across from her at the dining table, dressed in a crisp white shirt despite being home. He reviewed something on his tablet while eating, eggs prepared exactly how he preferred, coffee measured to the gram. Amina sipped her tea and watched him with quiet curiosity. "You don't have to eat with me," she said finally. He glanced up, his expression neutral. "The agreement specifies shared meals to establish routine." "The agreement specifies public coordination," she corrected gently. "Not breakfast surveillance." Something flickered in his eyes, not quite amusement, but close. "Surveillance is inaccurate," he replied. "This is optimization." "Of what?" "Coexistence." Amina nodded slowly, suppressing a smile. "So you're optimizing the act of eating toast in proximity?" For the first time, she thought she detected the ghost of tension in his jaw, the closest thing to embarrassment she'd seen from him. "Efficiency," he clarified. "Not surveillance." "Noted." He returned to his tablet. But she noticed he didn't actually read anything for the next 30 seconds. The days settled into rhythm. Hyun-suk left early for the office, returning late. Amina worked from the penthouse or met clients at neutral locations. They communicated primarily through the shared calendar, color-coded, meticulously updated, frighteningly accurate. But Hyun-suk noticed things. Small things. Amina worked in disciplined intervals, 90 minutes of focus, 15 minutes of movement. She listened to jazz while reviewing financial models. She drank tea in the morning, switched to water by noon, never touched alcohol during work hours. She was precise without being rigid. Intelligent without needing to prove it. He observed the way she moved through problems, deconstructing complexity into clarity, identifying leverage points others missed. It was the methodology of someone who understood systems but refused to be controlled by them. He told himself this was professional interest. Understanding her patterns made coordination more efficient. He didn't examine why he checked the calendar 3 times a day to see where she'd be. Amina noticed his watchfulness but didn't feel threatened by it. Hyun-suk didn't intrude. Didn't question her choices. Didn't impose expectations beyond what was contractually specified. His observation felt more like cautious assessment than control, as if he were trying to understand something fundamentally unfamiliar. Her. On Thursday evening, the notification appeared in their shared calendar. Saturday, 7 p.m., Kong Global Annual Gala Public Appearance, Mandatory Wardrobe, Formal/Press Attendance Confirmed. Amina stared at the notification for a long moment. Their first major public test. No rehearsal. No script. Just 2 people pretending to be something they weren't in front of Seoul's most influential observers, investors, executives, journalists who made careers out of detecting precisely the kind of performance they were about to deliver. She found Hyun-suk in his study that evening, reviewing what looked like seating arrangements. "Saturday," she said simply. He looked up. "Yes." "Any specific expectations?" "Appear comfortable. Stay within conversational distance. Avoid contradicting me publicly." Amina raised an eyebrow. The last one wasn't in the contract. His expression remained unreadable. "It's strategy, not control." "Clear distinction," she replied dryly. For a moment, something almost human passed between them, not warmth exactly, but recognition. 2 people about to walk into performance neither had rehearsed. "We'll be fine," Hyun-suk said quietly. Amina nodded. But neither of them was certain. The Kong Global Annual Gala occupied the entire top floor of the Signal Seoul, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a living canvas, champagne fountains catching light from Swarovski chandeliers, 200 of Asia's most influential executives circulating through carefully orchestrated conversations. Amina arrived beside Hyun-suk in a midnight blue gown that was elegant without being ostentatious. Simple. Confident. Entirely her own choice. He had reviewed wardrobe options with his stylist. She had politely declined all of them. "Stay close," he murmured as they entered. "Deflect personal questions. Emphasize stability." Amina nodded once but said nothing. The room noticed them immediately. Whispers rippled outward like concentric circles. Seoul's youngest chairman, notoriously private, arriving with a woman no one had vetted. Speculation began before they reached the first conversation cluster. Hyun-suk introduced her with practiced efficiency. "This is Amina Bello, my wife." Wife. The word still felt like a foreign language in his mouth. The initial responses were predictable: polite curiosity, veiled assessment, the particular smile wealthy men reserved for decorative spouses. Amina received it all with composed patience. Then an executive from Kong Global's European logistics division made his mistake. "So you're the reason our chairman finally settled down," he said with patronizing warmth. "What do you do with yourself in Seoul? Shopping? Korean language classes?" Amina's smile didn't waver. "I consult on financial risk assessment, primarily for cross-border investments. Currently analyzing volatility patterns in emerging African markets. I noticed your Q3 projections for the Lagos expansion assumed currency stability that doesn't exist. You might want to revisit those models before the board meeting." The executive blinked. "Recalibrated. You're familiar with our expansion strategy?" "I'm familiar with flawed assumptions," Amina replied pleasantly. The two often intersect. Silence bloomed around them, not awkward, but attentive. Another voice cut in. "Which market specifically?" Amina turned, and for the next 10 minutes, she dissected infrastructure challenges, regulatory frameworks, and investment timelines with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating exactly these complexities. The conversation shifted. Executives leaned in. Questions multiplied. Hyun-suk stood beside her, silent, watching the room reconfigure itself around her presence. She hadn't deferred to him. Hadn't glanced his direction for approval. Hadn't performed. She had simply existed, intelligent, articulate, entirely self-possessed. And the room responded. Something tightened in Hyun-suk's chest, unfamiliar, uncomfortable, impossible to categorize. He told himself it was reputation management. She represented Kong Global now. Her competence reflected on him. Logical. Strategic. Nothing more. But then he noticed the others. A senior investor from Singapore positioning himself closer to Amina. A venture capitalist laughing too warmly at something she said. The way conversation seemed to orbit her now instead of him. Hyun-suk found himself moving incrementally closer to her side. When the Singapore investor suggested they continue their discussion over drinks, Hyun-suk interrupted smoothly. "Unfortunately, we have other commitments this evening." Amina glanced at him, one eyebrow raised slightly. They had no other commitments. "Of course," the investor said, stepping back. "Perhaps another time." "Perhaps," Amina replied neutrally. As the evening progressed, Hyun-suk noticed his own patterns shifting. He stood closer during introductions. Redirected conversations that lasted too long. Suggested they move to different clusters when certain executives monopolized her attention. For optimal networking, he told himself. Strategic circulation. But when a tech entrepreneur asked for Amina's contact information directly, Hyun-suk provided his assistant's email instead. "All professional inquiries route through official channels," he said evenly. Amina noticed. Said nothing. But her eyes held questions she didn't voice. On the drive home, silence filled the car like a third presence. "You performed well," Hyun-suk said finally. "I didn't perform," Amina corrected quietly. "I participated." "The distinction matters to you. Doesn't it matter to you?" He had no answer for that. Back at the penthouse, they moved through their separation ritual, goodnight exchanged with professional courtesy, retreat to opposite wings, doors closing on carefully maintained distance. In his study, Hyun-suk reviewed the evening's interactions with meticulous attention. Analyzing networking outcomes. Evaluating strategic connections. Cataloging follow-up priorities. But his mind kept returning to irrelevant details. The way she'd corrected that executive without hostility. The way others had leaned toward her, drawn by something he couldn't quantify. The way she'd looked at him when he interrupted the investor, not angry, but aware. He told himself it was nothing. Just operational awareness. Pattern recognition. Strategic observation. Nothing more. But somewhere in the hollow perfection of the penthouse, something had shifted. And Hyun-Suk Kang, who controlled everything, felt control beginning to slip. It started with perfume. Hyun-Suk noticed on Tuesday morning that Amina had switched fragrances, something lighter, with notes of citrus and white tea instead of the subtle amber she'd worn before. He registered this information clinically, filed it away as data, and told himself it was irrelevant. By Thursday, he knew she only wore the new perfume on days when she had client meetings. By Friday, he was checking her calendar to predict which scent she'd choose. This was pattern recognition, he told himself. Operational awareness. Understanding the people in his professional sphere was simply good management. The fact that Amina wasn't actually in his professional sphere, that she was contractually separate, autonomously operating, didn't register as contradiction. He noticed other things too. She switched from heels to flats after events lasting longer than 3 hours. She paused fractionally before answering difficult questions, not from uncertainty, but precision, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses incisions. She read financial reports with a pen in hand but rarely made notes, as if marking the page would contaminate her thinking. Small things. Irrelevant things. Things he had no operational reason to catalog. Wednesday afternoon, his assistant mentioned that Amina had adjusted 2 meetings in their shared calendar. Hyun-Suk opened the schedule, studied the changes, then cross-referenced them against his own commitments. Why did she move the Thursday consultation, he asked. His assistant blinked. I'm not sure, sir. Would you like me to inquire? No. Too quick. Too sharp. That won't be necessary. But 20 minutes later, he checked the calendar again. Thursday evening, he found himself reviewing security footage from the building lobby. Strictly routine, he told himself. Monitoring traffic patterns. Ensuring protocols were followed. The footage showed Amina returning at 6:47 p.m., laughing at something her colleague said. A man Hyun-Suk didn't recognize. Mid-30s. Well-dressed. Too familiar in his body language. Hyun-Suk watched the clip twice. Then closed the window and told himself it was irrelevant. Friday brought the first real fracture. Amina was scheduled for a consultation dinner with a potential client, a venture capitalist expanding into West African markets. Standard networking. Professionally appropriate. Hyun-Suk suggested she reschedule. The timing conflicts with optimal weekly rhythm, he said over breakfast, not looking up from his tablet. Amina set down her tea carefully. What timing? My calendar is clear. For efficiency. You've had 3 evening commitments this week. 2, she corrected. And both were my professional obligations, not social events. Excessive evening scheduling impacts performance quality. Amina studied him with an expression he couldn't read. You're monitoring my meeting frequency. I'm optimizing our shared schedule. My dinner isn't on our shared schedule. It's on mine. The silence stretched thin and taut. Of course, Hyun-Suk said finally. My mistake. But he didn't apologize. And he didn't stop tracking. Saturday morning, Amina found him in the kitchen, making coffee at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than his normal routine. You changed your schedule, she observed. Minor adjustment. To coincide with mine. Not a question. A statement. Hyun-Suk measured coffee grounds with meticulous precision. Coincidence. Hyun-Suk. Her voice was calm but unyielding. You've been adjusting my meetings, monitoring my calendar, appearing in spaces I occupy more frequently than random chance would predict. What are you doing? Ensuring coordination. We're coordinated. We have been since day one. This is something else. He set down the coffee scoop, finally meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, controlled, measured, giving away nothing. You represent calm global in public settings, he said evenly. Your professional conduct impacts our shared objectives. Basic oversight is logical. Oversight, Amina repeated softly. Is that what you're calling this? What else would it be? The question hung between them like a challenge neither wanted to answer. Amina held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Just remember, I didn't sign up for oversight. I signed up for autonomy. She left the kitchen. Hyun-suk remained standing by the counter, coffee forgotten, staring at the space she'd occupied. He told himself she was wrong. This wasn't obsession. It was risk management. Protective vigilance. Strategic awareness of variables that could impact carefully constructed arrangements. Logical. Rational. Controlled. But that night, he found himself standing by his study window at 11:43 p.m., listening for the sound of her bedroom door closing, counting the seconds until her light went dark, his chest tight with something he refused to name. Control was what he did. Control was who he was. But somewhere in the precision of his perfectly ordered life, control had begun its quiet, irreversible collapse. And Hyun-suk Kang had no equation to stop it. The press conference in Singapore was supposed to be routine. Kang Global was announcing a major partnership with a Pan-Asian logistics consortium, billions in projected revenue, hundreds of jobs, the kind of deal that made headlines across 3 continents. Hyun-suk sat at the center of the dais, flanked by consortium representatives and legal advisors. Amina sat 2 seats to his left, present as his wife but not required to speak. She hadn't asked to be there. He had added her to the manifest without discussion. Public visibility strengthens the stability narrative, he'd said that morning. She had simply nodded and gotten dressed. The questions came predictably: financial projections, regulatory frameworks, timeline expectations. Hyun-suk answered each with clinical precision, his responses calibrated for maximum information with minimum vulnerability. Then a journalist from Bloomberg raised her hand. Mrs. Kang, there have been questions about Kang Global's ethical oversight following last year's supply chain audit. As someone with a background in risk assessment, do you believe the company's current ethics protocols are sufficient? The room held its breath. Hyun-suk's jaw tightened imperceptibly. This wasn't a question for her. This was a trap designed to create daylight between them, to expose cracks in the carefully maintained facade. But before he could redirect, Amina leaned toward her microphone. I believe any company operating at this scale should view ethics as infrastructure, not decoration, she said evenly. Kang Global has made significant improvements in transparency and accountability over the past 18 months. Could more be done? Always. But the trajectory suggests genuine commitment rather than performative compliance. Measured. Accurate. Entirely her own assessment. The journalist followed up. And you believe? Hyun-suk's voice cut through smoothly. What my wife is saying is that Kang Global exceeds industry standards in every measurable category. Our protocols are. Actually, Amina interrupted, her tone pleasant but unyielding, what I'm saying is exactly what I said. She turned back to the journalist. Ethics aren't binary. They're continuous. Any claim to perfection should be treated with skepticism. What matters is demonstrable progress and genuine accountability. The room went absolutely silent. Hyun-suk felt something snap behind his carefully controlled expression, not visible to cameras, but violent in its internal rupture. She had contradicted him. Publicly. In front of international media. He recovered smoothly, redirecting to the next question, but the rest of the conference blurred into white noise. His responses were automatic, mechanical, while his mind fixated on a single burning thought. She had undermined him. The flight back to Seoul was conducted in rigid silence. They arrived at the penthouse near midnight. Amina headed directly toward her room. "We need to discuss what happened," Hyun-suk said, his voice controlled but tight. She stopped. Turned. "What happened is I answered a question honestly. You contradicted me in front of the international press." "No. I completed my own thought. You interrupted me. I was protecting the company's position." Amina's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with something more dangerous, clarity. "No," she said quietly. "You were asserting control because you're losing it." The words landed like a physical blow. "That's absurd." "Is it?" She stepped closer, her voice steady but unyielding. "You've been monitoring my schedule. Adjusting my meetings. Appearing in my spaces. Interrupting my conversations. And now, overriding me publicly when I'm doing exactly what you claim to want, presenting as competent, credible, autonomous." "I was managing." "You were possessing," Amina corrected. "And I didn't agree to that." Hyun-suk's hands clenched at his sides. Every instinct screamed to argue, to rationalize, to reconstruct his position with irrefutable logic. But she wasn't wrong. And they both knew it. "The contract specifies public coordination," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The contract specifies appearances. Not submission. Not override. Not control. I'm protecting what we've built." "What you've built," Amina interrupted. "And you're destroying it by forgetting I'm not your employee. Not your property. Not a variable you can optimize." The silence that followed felt like freefall. "I will honor the contract," Amina continued, her tone final. "But if you interrupt me again, publicly or privately, if you continue monitoring me, managing me, treating my autonomy as negotiable, I will walk away. And money won't stop me. Contracts won't stop me. Nothing will." She picked up her coat. "Where are you going?" The question came out sharper than intended. "Out," she said simply. "Because I can." The door closed behind her with quiet finality. Hyun-suk stood alone in the penthouse, immaculate, perfectly ordered, unbearably empty. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he had no response. No strategy. No leverage. No solution. Just the hollow echo of his own obsession, finally named. And the terrifying realization that he was losing the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Her. The penthouse had never felt this empty. Hyun-suk sat in his study, the city sprawling beneath him like a constellation of variables he would never control. 2:47 a.m. Amina hadn't returned. He knew because he'd been listening for the door, not from surveillance, but from something rawer, more desperate. Fear. He hadn't checked her location. Hadn't called. Hadn't sent his driver. Because she was right. The realization had arrived slowly over the past 3 hours, dismantling his carefully constructed rationalizations one by one. He had told himself it was strategy. Risk management. Operational oversight. All lies. He had been trying to possess something he had no right to own. Hyun-suk had spent 15 years building an empire on control, optimizing systems, eliminating uncertainty, turning chaos into profit. But Amina wasn't a system. She was a person. A brilliant, autonomous person who had agreed to stand beside him, not beneath him. And he had repaid that trust with surveillance disguised as care. The truth sat in his chest like shattered glass. The obsession hadn't been about protecting what he'd built. It had been about terror of losing something he'd never planned to want. Her. At 3:12 a.m., he heard the door open. He didn't move. Didn't call out. Just listened to her footsteps crossing the marble, steady, unhurried, entirely her own. Her bedroom door closed softly. Hyun-suk exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The next morning, he didn't appear at breakfast. Or the morning after that. Amina noticed immediately. The shared calendar showed his schedule, meetings, calls, site inspections, but their paths no longer intersected. He had stopped optimizing their coexistence. He had simply stepped back. 3 days passed. Then 5. No adjustments to her calendar. No questions about her meetings. No strategic suggestions for optimal coordination. Just space. On the 6th evening, Amina returned to find something unexpected. Hyun-suk in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, surrounded by ingredients that looked more like a science experiment than dinner preparation. He didn't notice her at first. His focus was absolute, measuring, adjusting, completely absorbed. "You cook?" she asked. He looked up, momentarily unguarded. "I'm attempting to." "Successfully?" "The data is inconclusive." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "What are you making?" "Jollof rice." He paused. "I thought, you mentioned it once. Months ago." "I don't know if I remembered correctly." Amina felt something shift in her chest, subtle, unexpected. He had been listening. Not monitoring. Listening. "You remembered correctly," she said quietly. She moved closer, studying his work. "But you've added too much tomato paste. It'll be too acidic. Adjust the ratio. Add water. Small amounts. Taste as you go." They worked in silence, not the rigid quiet of strangers, but something closer to collaboration. She guided. He adjusted. No power struggle. No possession. Just two people making dinner. When they finally sat down to eat, the rice wasn't perfect. But it was honest. "I overstepped," Hyun-suk said finally, his voice low. "At the press conference. Before that." Repeatedly. Amina set down her fork, waiting. "I told myself it was strategy," he continued. "Risk management. But it was fear." "Fear of what?" He met her eyes, no calculation, no armor. Just truth. That you would realize you didn't need this arrangement. That you would leave. And that I would have no leverage to stop you. The confession hung between them like something fragile. "You were right," he said. "I was trying to control you because I was losing control of myself. And that was unfair. Unacceptable. I apologize." Amina studied him carefully, the man who had begun as pure strategy and was slowly, painfully, becoming human. "Thank you," she said finally. "For stopping. For stepping back. For saying that. I should have said it sooner. You're saying it now." Something passed between them then, not romance, but recognition. The acknowledgement that they had both entered this arrangement as one thing and were slowly becoming something else entirely. The following week brought news that shifted everything. The International Ethics Committee approved the expansion deal, unconditionally. No requirements. No oversight. No stipulations about family image. The marriage was no longer necessary. Hyun-suk received the notification during a board meeting. Read it twice. Felt the ground shift beneath everything he had carefully constructed. That evening, he found Amina in the living room, laptop open, working through projections. "The committee approved the deal," he said quietly. She looked up. "Congratulations." Without conditions. Understanding dawned slowly in her eyes. "So the contract is fulfilled." 18 months completed ahead of schedule. Amina closed her laptop carefully. Neither spoke. The arrangement that had brought them together no longer existed. And neither of them knew what came next. The document sat on the glass table between them like a verdict. Contract termination agreement, mutual release of obligations. Amina had drafted it herself, clean, precise, legally airtight. 18 months compressed into 3 pages of terms and clauses. Compensation settled. Assets divided. Public narrative agreed upon, amicable separation, mutual respect, private reasons. Everything resolved except the signature line. Hyun-suk read through it twice, his expression unreadable. Outside, Seoul glittered in the December darkness, winter settling over the city like held breath. "This is thorough," he said finally. "I wanted to make it simple. You've always been efficient." Amina watched him carefully. His voice was steady, but something beneath the surface felt fractured. "The deal is approved. We both fulfilled our obligations. There's no reason to continue the arrangement." "No," he agreed quietly. "No logical reason." The emphasis on logical hung in the air between them. Hyun-suk set down the document. Looked at her directly, no calculation, no strategy, just raw honesty that felt almost painful in its exposure. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Without leverage. Without obligation. Without any element of transaction." Amina felt her heartbeat shift, quicken. "Ask. Stay." The word was simple. The weight behind it was not. "Not because of the contract," he continued, his voice carefully controlled but undeniably vulnerable. "Not as part of an arrangement or an image or a solution to an external problem. But because you choose to. Because you want to." Silence filled the space where certainty used to live. "Why?" Amina asked finally. "Why would you want that?" Hyun-suk stood, moved to the window, his back to her, the first time she'd seen him unable to maintain eye contact. "Because somewhere between strategy and obsession, between control and collapse, I stopped seeing you as a solution." His voice was quiet, almost raw. "And started seeing you as essential." "Essential to what?" "To everything." He turned back to face her. "I told myself I was hiring efficiency. Someone who could perform a role. Instead, I met someone who refused to perform. Who challenged me. Who made me question every assumption I had about how relationships, about how life, should be structured." Amina's throat tightened. "Hyun-suk. I'm not asking because I've earned it," he interrupted. "I know I haven't. I surveilled you. Controlled you. Treated your autonomy like something negotiable. And you would be entirely justified in walking away." He stepped closer, but kept distance between them, respecting boundaries even now. "But if there's any part of you," he continued, "any small part that has wondered whether this," he gestured between them, "could be something other than transaction, I'm asking you to stay. Not as my wife under contract. But as yourself. Entirely yourself. With complete freedom to leave whenever you choose." The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. Amina stood slowly, her mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with logic. She had entered this arrangement with clear boundaries. No illusions. No expectations beyond what was written. She had protected herself carefully, maintained autonomy, refused to be subsumed by his need for control. But somewhere along the way, she had noticed things too. The way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, adjusting his worldview in real time. The way he had stepped back when she demanded it, surrendering control rather than losing her. The way he had learned to cook jollof rice because she'd mentioned it once, months ago, in passing. The way he had apologized. Not with excuses. Not with justifications. But with genuine recognition of harm caused. She had watched him transform from a man who optimized everything into someone who was learning, painfully, imperfectly, to simply be human. "I need time," she said finally. Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly controlled. "Of course. Not because I'm uncertain about you," Amina clarified. "But because I need to be certain about me." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I spent months maintaining boundaries because I was afraid of losing myself in your orbit," she continued. If I stay, it can't be because the contract created momentum. It has to be because I genuinely choose this. Choose you. Without obligation. Without pressure. How much time? Amina looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had proposed marriage like a merger and was now asking for love like a prayer. I don't know yet, she said honestly. The answer hung between them, not rejection, but not acceptance either. Just truth. Hyun-suk picked up a pen from the table. Signed the termination agreement with steady hands. You're free, he said quietly. Completely free. The penthouse is yours as long as you want it. No obligations. No expectations. Where will you go? Wherever you're not. Until you decide. He left the signed document on the table. And walked toward his study, giving her the space she'd requested. Amina stood alone in the immaculate living room, holding a termination agreement that had just become the most complicated document of her life. Because for the first time, she had complete freedom. And absolutely no idea what to choose. 3 days passed. Hyun-suk moved to a corporate suite across the city, minimal, functional, deliberately temporary. He didn't ask where Amina was. Didn't check her location. Didn't monitor the penthouse security feeds. He simply waited. And for a man who had built an empire on controlling variables, waiting felt like drowning. On the 4th morning, his assistant forwarded an email. From Amina Bello, subject, terms. He opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. I have conditions. 1. We meet as equals. Not as chairman and consultant. Not as husband and wife under contract. As two people choosing each other without leverage. 2. You don't manage my schedule. You don't optimize my movements. You don't protect me from choices I'm capable of making myself. 3. We build something new. Not a contract. Not an arrangement. Something neither of us can control completely. 4. If this doesn't work, we both walk away with dignity. No lawyers. No negotiations. Just honesty. If you can agree to these terms, come home. A. Hyun-suk read it 3 times. Then left immediately. The penthouse looked different when he entered. Small changes, a throw blanket draped over the sculptural sofa, books stacked on the coffee table, her laptop open on the dining table surrounded by notes written in her precise handwriting. The space felt inhabited now, lived in, no longer a museum of perfect control. Amina stood by the window overlooking the Han River, wearing comfortable clothes instead of professional armor. She turned when she heard him. You came quickly, she observed. You asked me to come home. The word home landed differently than it ever had before. I've been thinking, Amina said, about what you said. About seeing me as essential. Hyun-suk waited, barely breathing. I realized something, she continued. I've been seeing you the same way. Not as a transaction or an arrangement or even as someone I was merely tolerating. But as someone who challenges me. Who matches me. Who learned to surrender control because keeping it meant losing me. She moved closer, her eyes steady on his. That terrified me, she admitted. Because I've spent my entire life protecting my autonomy. Refusing to compromise it for anyone. And then you, someone who represented everything I should avoid, somehow became the person I didn't want to walk away from. Amina. Let me finish. Her voice was gentle but firm. I don't know if this will work. I don't know if we can build something real from a foundation of contracts and calculated distance. But I know I want to try. Not because the deal requires it. Not because it's strategic. But because when I imagine my life without you in it, it feels less. Hyun-suk felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked away for 36 years, protected by logic and efficiency and the absolute certainty that emotion was weakness. I agree to your terms, he said, his voice rough. All of them. Completely. Even the loss of control. Especially that. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had begun as strangers in a transaction and somehow arrived at something neither had predicted. Amina closed the distance between them. Not tentatively. Not hesitantly. But with the same decisive clarity she brought to everything. Then we start again, she said. Not as chairman and consultant. Not as husband and wife under contract. Just as Hyun-suk and Amina. Two people choosing this. Choosing each other, he corrected quietly. Yes. Their first kiss was nothing like a business transaction. It was hesitant and certain all at once, the collision of two people who had spent months maintaining careful distance finally allowing themselves proximity. Not possession. Not obsession. Just genuine, chosen connection. When they pulled apart, Hyun-suk rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Building something without controlling it. Neither do I, Amina replied. But we'll figure it out. Together. As equals. As equals, he repeated, the words feeling like both surrender and freedom. That evening, they cooked dinner together, not perfectly, not efficiently, but with the kind of comfortable chaos that came from two people learning each other's rhythms without trying to optimize them. The penthouse felt different. Warmer. Lived in. Like a home instead of a showroom. Later, sitting on the sofa that was no longer purely sculptural, Amina leaned against Hyun-suk's shoulder while he read through a contract, not their contract, but a business proposal that actually required his attention. You know, she said quietly, the obsession you felt, I don't think it was about ownership. He looked down at her. No. I think it was about fear. Fear that something real, something you couldn't control or predict or optimize, might disappear if you didn't hold on tight enough. Hyun-suk was quiet for a long moment. You're right. And now? Now I'm learning that the only way to keep something real is to hold it gently. To respect its autonomy. To let it choose to stay. Amina smiled. Fast learner. I have a good teacher. Outside, Seoul continued its endless motion, millions of variables intersecting in patterns too complex to control. But inside, in a penthouse that had once felt like a prison of perfection, two people had built something neither could have designed. Not a contract. Not an arrangement. Just love, messy, unpredictable, entirely unchosen by logic and completely chosen by heart. And for Hyun-suk Kang, who had spent his entire life controlling everything, losing control had never felt more like winning. Love, he learned, was not something you controlled. It was something you earned. And then, if you were extraordinarily lucky, something you were chosen by in return.